how we honor him. We're to have no other gods before him, and so on. They're about our God being supreme and us having a loving loyalty to Yahweh that is above all other things that we have in our lives. In fact, these really address our relationship with God, and as we continue this week on the remaining 6 commandments, we're going to see that in one respect they deal with our relationships with other people, our interpersonal relationships, how we deal with people in this life, so our horizontal relationships. And yet there's something more than just how we deal with each other. If we look at the first 4 commandments, we might state that the underlying principles which would apply to us today, which is really what is critical here for us, we are to have no other gods that would compete with our loyalty to Yahweh, to Jehovah. We are not to make any graven image, he says, any carving, anything that we might worship that might cause our worship of God to be even distracted. We are not to take the name of the Lord's name in vain, the name of the Lord in vain. Another word would be bear, to put on, to wear, to bear the name of the Lord in vain. But instead to bear his name with the utmost reverence. And the commandment of the Sabbath, we are to rest in his work that he has done, his holiness that he has has demonstrated through Christ's life, and sanctifying every day, not just one day per week, but we are to set aside every day to honor him, to worship him. And now as we turn to these last 6 commandments that really instruct us in, as I said, our horizontal or interpersonal relationships, really these teach us to pattern ourselves after God. And we could consider in each of these things how Jesus conducted himself when he was a man walking on the earth. We could also look at his words in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 as he referred to these commandments and what he thought of them. Well, as we have been doing, we're going to read a portion. We're going to go ahead and read the verses 16 through 21, which is the commandments, and then we're going to take a closer look at these, and then we're going to continue reading through verse 33 after that, and then we're going to draw some general conclusions for us to take home today, or challenges. So in verse 16, Moses continues, and he says, "Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long, and it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. And you shall not steal. And you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." Now, really, I'd want to, even though we're looking at these 6, I kind of want to back up a little bit. And first of all, I want to remind us, if there's one statement throughout the book of Deuteronomy that Moses is making to the children of Israel, and I believe God is making to us today, it is this one: to choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him, obeying him. And so he wants us to choose life by loving him. And Jesus said that. The greatest commandment is that thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. And of course, obeying him. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments, Jesus said. And so, but the The second, he said, is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so really, these last 6 commandments could be grouped under that idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, as we'll take a look shortly. Okay. So these commandments all center on really one common theme. All of the commandments center on one common theme, that God is supreme, and your loyalty shall be to him and to him alone. Moses had said, the Lord our God is one, and there's none other. There's none like him. There's none that can be compared with him. And furthermore, if we look at these commands and we realize something really important, kind of radical, following these commands lives out this reality that God is supreme, that the Lord our God is one God. And therefore, because of that fact, we should worship him and him alone. And of course, as we saw last week, this is clearly demonstrated in the first 4 commandments that we just reviewed. But as the remaining 6, they definitely reinforce our loyalty to God in the scope of our horizontal interpersonal relationships, particularly as we look at the principles that underlie each one. For, if you look at some of these commands, okay, we'll skip honor your father and your mother for a moment, because that may be, one of the most difficult for us, really. Not necessarily for us here, but for believers today to follow. But go on, you shall not murder. Well, how many of us have even been tempted to murder someone lately? Well, no, I don't think we have. Or, commit adultery. Okay, that definitely happens in our world, but I don't think that any of us are, on that edge of committing adultery. I don't think that that's even within the scope of our decision-making process week after week, and stealing, bearing false witness, going and in the I don't know if, I think that the wording leads one to believe that is literally go to court and testify against someone falsely. And of course, we can see that generally that is really lying, because Jesus said, don't swear before God. He said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And so when people say things like honest to God, or, I swear on my mother's grave, or, whatever they say, Jesus is saying, you don't want to have to say, okay, I'm telling you the truth all the time, but right now I'm really telling you the truth. So what does that mean about what I did yesterday when I didn't swear on my mother's grave? Well, maybe I wasn't telling the truth. So, all of these things are really focusing in on, it looks like these should be fairly easy for us to obey, but actually what's important is for us to kind of get under the surface and look at what is really going on here. What is God really telling them? And Jesus, of course, if we read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we can see that Jesus communicated there's far more going on here than thou shalt not murder. He said, if you've hated your brother, you've already murdered him in your heart. If you've lusted after, a woman, then you've already committed adultery in your heart. And so if we look through that lens that was not conveyed here in the law, but if we look through that lens, we can see that there's no question that we are all guilty. We are all guilty. So it's interesting to me that the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Really, there's so many ways to look at the 10 commandments, and one of the ways is for us to realize that this is the commandment. All of the commandments could be summed up in this: have no other gods before me. Have nothing which could compete with me in your loyalty. Your loyalty is to be completely and solely to the Supreme One, the Lord alone. And the other 9 commandments really I'll say, clarify or build on this idea. You shall not make any carved or graven image. Not of another God and not of Yahweh. We've never seen God, so we don't know what he looks like. So therefore, there is no sense in trying to make a graven image. And anyway, that graven image would detract us from our worship of him. It's been said that the reason that we don't have the cross Jesus died on is because it would be worshipped. We would worship that as a relic in place of our worship for God. And yet, how many crosses, how many houses could be built from the pieces, the relics that have been bought and sold, that have been claimed to be part of the cross? Similarly, with the actual scriptures, the original writings, the penning of John or Deuteronomy, the original pennings, we do not have those. We have copies that have been carefully copied and passed down. We don't have the originals. And you ask, why not? Well, people would be worshiping those. You can go to Washington, D.C., and you can see just documents that were written 250 years ago on display under careful. They don't even want light in there because it causes that ink to fade on that parchment that they wrote our founding documents on. And can you imagine what we would do if we had these original parchments that Paul wrote on? We would be worshiping those things. And so this all goes to the idea that we as humans, we do this. And so God declared, don't make anything that would compete with me, with your worship and loyalty to me. You would be loyal to these other things, so don't do that. He goes on, he says, you shall not take God's name in vain. We know that this as I've said last week and in past weeks, there's another word here that really, in my opinion, fits better. We were created in his image, and we are to bear his image. As a star bears light, or the moon bears the light of the sun, reflects the light of the sun. That is what we are to do. And we carry his name as Christians, as Christ ones. And we are not to do that in vain. We are to represent him, represent who he is to the world, not so that we would be worshiped, but so that the glory would be, go to him, reflection of his glory. Demonstration, because we as sinners, our demonstration of what his love has done, are we not? We don't come and say we're perfect, and that's why, you should believe, what we say about God. No, we're sinners, but we're saved by his grace, and that is why you should also trust his grace. So we should bear his name with respect and with, we should bear it. I think about, as a family, you want your children to carry your name with respect, do you not? You want people around them, when they hear that last name, to think, oh, well, they did a good job of raising their children. Those children are living out, and I'm not talking about as young children, I'm talking about as adults. They're living out the principles that they were taught by their parents, and they become a reflection of their parents' name, of their parent really life and decisions. And in the same way, we are to bear God's name with that kind of respect, with that kind of loyalty. And of course, he sums up the 4 commandments with, you shall honor the Sabbath to keep it holy. And the whole idea of the Sabbath was really, okay, you've worked all week, set aside that work, and now focus on God. Don't allow those things to obstruct you from your worship of God and your loyalty to him, the recognition of his supremacy. And of course, as I pointed out last week in the book of Hebrews, we're told really, as Christians, there's no reason that we should restrict that loyalty, that focus to one day. No, it's expanded to all the days of our lives. And in the analogy, of course, is given that we should rest from our works because he has done the work to give us salvation. We cannot earn our salvation, and so therefore we should rest and focus on him and worship him. Find it very interesting if we look back at verse 15, and I realized that I'm preaching last week's sermon. Just bear with me for a moment. I kind of want to show the continuity, and because I broke it into 2 weeks, we kind of lost that continuity. But if we look back at verse 15 here in Deuteronomy 5, he says, "Recall that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by strength and power. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." And so we realize that deliverance from Egypt was a type of our salvation. It was really a prophecy of the way that we would be given salvation, that we would be delivered from sin, from this world, not necessarily physically at this time, but our loyalty is to be to him. That is why he's commanded us to rest from our works, because he has done the work through his strength and power. And he did that both on the cross and through his, Jesus' resurrection, which was absolutely necessary. Without the resurrection, there would be no resurrection for us. And so those two things, his death and his resurrection, are both necessary for us. And so we see that in the type, in the really prophecy of our salvation, we see that we should, just the same as the Israelites, set aside their works. We should set aside our works, and we should rest in what he has done, and we should worship him as preeminent in our lives. So as we continue this morning, we see the first of these 6 commandments that we're going to look at is honor your father and your mother. You'll honor your father and your mother, he says. And as we do this, number one, we are honoring this divine authority that God has bestowed upon us. He has told us, what other authority has he specifically told us to honor in this way? Now, Paul does say, when he gets to Romans chapter 13, that we should submit ourselves to, the powers that God has put over us, the government. But this is the one that God singles out here in the 10 Commandments: honor your father and your mother. For he knows that this is the basic building block of society. Without honor of your father and mother, you really have nothing. Of course, this is, the other side of the coin is that your father and your mother should be teaching their children about God and his faithfulness. And he will go on, we'll see in chapter 6. And we've already seen this, but specifically in chapter 6. He tells the parents to, from the time you wake up in the morning till the time you go to bed, be teaching your children about God and his faithfulness. Be using the things that happen in life to point back to the glory of God, to really fulfill the 10 Commandments by loving and honoring God supremely above all else. See, God is supreme. He created an order. And following that order, by honoring our parents, honoring his authority, is really honoring God. If we honor our parents, we are honoring God in honoring our parents, because that is an authority that he's put over us. Now we could get into what if your parents are evil and all these other things. Well, yes, we could go into all of that, and I think there are answers to that. But fundamentally, we should honor our parents, period. obviously, God is telling the parents to do certain things, to teach their children certain things. So it shouldn't become difficult for us to honor our parents. And yet, as we look around the world today, what do we see? We do not see children honoring their parents. This is a heartache for many of us. We see the decisions that our children are making as adults. We still call them children, but they're adults. And it breaks our hearts. We've taught them, or I trust we've taught them. We've been faithful to whatever degree we could be faithful, whatever point we were at, to teach them about God. I know that we have taught. I know that I can speak for myself. We have taught our children. And yet, they don't always follow what we've told them. There's a proverb that we often turn to, and I do want to stress that I don't believe this is a promise, and I know that can be disturbing. There's a proverb that if you teach your children, train them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. And that's a proverb. It's generally true that if you teach them in the right way, they'll grow up and they won't depart from it, or they will come back. Actually, it's train up a child in the way he should go. I mixed my scriptures up. Train up a child in the way he should go. And I think that there's truth in that, but it's not a one-for-one promise. It's just not. Our children always have the opportunity to make choices for themselves, just like we have opportunities to make choices for ourselves. But we need to understand, and I want us to realize that this is not necessarily a commandment to young children. We're all children. Except for Adam and Eve, every human that ever lived had a mother and father, did we not? Adam and Eve are the only ones that did not. And so, this is a general, lifelong, even if our parents are no longer with us, in the decisions that we make, we can still hear their voices in our ears as we are tempted to do different things or given choices before us. And I can hear my mom saying, can't you hear that? We all can identify with that to some degree. And we can honor what we were taught by our parents. And that is a command. And when we do that, we're honoring God. We are recognizing the God's supremacy, because this is a command that is in a sense is transitive. Not transitive. That's not the right word. I was thinking of mathematics. It's because God gave his authority, and his authority is passed on. So that is why obeying our parents is obeying God. Okay. As we go on to the next commandment, it's a very short one. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder. Well, let's dig just a little bit under the surface there, and we know that God created life. God created life. He created humans in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he created them in the image of God. He gave a special purpose for people, for humankind, that he did not give to any other animal or any other created thing, and that is to bear the image of God. And so, if someone takes a life by murder, it is to promote ourselves above God's authority, to decide that while God gave life, I can take life. No. Job said, God has given and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He does not want us to usurp his authority over life to determine that we can take life. Well, obviously, we know that there's more to this command as well, as we see, and I mentioned already that Jesus said, you've heard that it said, thou shalt not, kill. Well, I say to you that anyone who's hated his brother has already committed murder in his heart. That kind of puts it at a place that we can grapple with. As I said earlier, thou shalt not murder. That seems like an easy command for us to obey. When you realize that if we've hated our brother, we've already committed murder in our heart. No, so Jesus is saying, look under the hood a little bit and realize that it's not the act of murder, even though that's obviously a sin. It's the motivation for murder. And so then we can start thinking about what are those motivations and where do they come from? And, if we continue, and I'm not going to take the time, we could really take time this morning, take one of these commandments at a time and really look deep. And I'm not purposing to do that. We would probably spend about 10 weeks going through the 10 commandments, and I'm not interested in doing that. I don't think you are either, but I just want us to realize that as we dig underneath our motivations, what we begin to see is that hatred for our brother, comes from some pride, some comparison that we make between our brother and ourselves. And ultimately, it is making ourselves like a God. It is elevating ourselves to a point where we matter so much that our hatred for our brother means that they don't matter. It's creating this, really, we become ourselves almost an idol before God. We make ourselves supreme when we do this kind of thing. So as we dig under the surface, we see there's so much more to this command than merely not to take a life. Now, I'll just mention, without trying to go into all of the ins and outs of this, I'll mention that there's an area that is difficult for us to understand, and I'll let you grapple with that this week, and I hope you will. I hope that you'll bring it before God because it's real. So why is it that God told the children of Israel to go in and kill these other nations, and not to leave a man, woman, or child alive? This is a very difficult thing that I do not. I could go in. I actually have talked a little bit about this in the past, but we're going to see something as we read in. We're going to take a look in the book of Exodus in just a moment. And we're going to see that Moses told the Levites to take a sword by their side and go kill their family and companions. And I read it this morning, and it's just utterly shocking to read, especially alongside of this command, you shall not murder. So I'll let you grapple a bit with that, and I won't try to stand up here and give all the answers. I let you in on a little secret. I don't have all the answers. I grapple with these things as well. I believe God's word as he gave it to us. But there are things that I grapple with, and you should grapple with them as well. I think that as we, in good faith, grapple with those things and ask God to show us that he will, and he draws us closer to him as we deal with things that maybe we think are contradictions. Okay, now that I've stirred everybody up and made everybody uncomfortable, he goes on and he says, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not commit adultery. And think again in terms of creation. After God had created Adam, he specifically said it's not good that man should be alone, and he caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he took a rib out of his side, and he formed Eve from Adam's rib. And he said, I'll make a helpmeet that's suitable for Adam. When a man and woman are married, it is under the authority of God that they are pronounced man and wife. To commit adultery is to violate God's own design for marriage. Now, you could say, what about fornication? What about, sex outside of marriage? Like, not, because we think of adultery as if you're married and you're having sex with someone else or they're married. Well, even fornication, God used these concepts that are very real. I'll say marriage is a very real thing. As you all know, you've all been married for some years. You know that marriage is a very real thing, and the principles that are taught in Scripture come in very handy when you're trying to, navigate the difficulties of life. Yet God used marriage as a picture of faithfulness to God in particular. He talked about the children of Israel in relation to God as that of a marriage. Conversely, he used the word adultery as a picture of unfaithfulness to God. In fact, he called the nation Israel an adulterous generation because they chose to disobey these 10 commandments, to set aside their loyalty to God and God alone, and to worship other, maybe even themselves or other gods. Or, you go through the Old Testament and you see this repeated again and again and again and again. They were unfaithful to him. They were adulterous. God uses this idea as really a picture. And that is true also of sex in itself. It is the working out of a very sacred relationship. It is a joy that is to be enjoyed within the context of that God-endorsed relationship, that God created divine relationship between a man and a woman. Well, he goes on here and he says, you shall not steal. Take things that are not your own. Well, one of the things that we see as Israel has wandered through the wilderness is that God provided for Israel. The quintessential example of that is the manna. And the idea that they were not allowed to gather more manna than they needed for one day. And why was that? Well, it went bad. But I think that was God's divine power causing it to go bad because he wanted to instill in them the idea that day by day by day you are to trust me. Don't get ahead of yourself and don't get ahead of me. We are to trust him. Except for one day of the week, you'll remember that in order that they would not have to work on that seventh day, the Sabbath, he said you can gather twice as much on Friday, and on Saturday it will last so that you can have enough to eat. That was the only day, which really, in my opinion, is just proof that this was divine power, and it wasn't just, like if you leave the milk out, it'll go bad. No, this was God's divine plan. And so, why is this important? Well, God provides for us. Stealing from someone else is saying that God hasn't provided enough for me. There's something going on there that is more than just taking someone else. It's not trusting God. And as we see in the New Testament, Paul says that a man shouldn't eat unless he works. So there's another aspect of this, that we should, maybe it's our own unfaithfulness to actually apply ourselves and work so that we would have. And Paul goes on, not only so that we would have so we don't have to steal, but he says so that we would have that we could give to others who are in need, genuine need. There is genuine need. But never, never is there a need to steal. No, God provides one way or another. And in fact, the interesting thing is, just like the manna, if we don't have a need, then we don't have an opportunity to see God provide, do we? If we have everything we need for the rest of our lives, then we don't have a need to see God provide. I think that God causes us at times in our life to have those needs so that he can show us that he will provide if we're faithful to trust in him instead of try to acquire what we need in some other way. And one of those ways would be stealing. No, to steal is to deny God's promise to provide. It's another way of saying God isn't good enough. His promises, his provision isn't good enough. And so that would lead us to steal. But if we love him, if we are loyalty to our supreme Lord, then we will not do this because we will see that he'll provide for us. We will have a trust in him. And now the last, I guess he's got two more. Sorry. I can see the one down here. So he says, you shall not bear false witness. Don't misrepresent the truth. God is truth. To bear false witness, to lie, is to directly violate the very character of God. And of course, then we can start, and I didn't do this on all of these others, but we can start digging under the surface and see why is it that we're doing these things? Why is it that we're murdering? I talked about that. Why is it that we would commit adultery? Why is it that we would steal? Why is it that we would bear false witness? Most of the time, when people lie, they have a reason. Think of the old cookie jar. The cookie jar is empty. Who got into the cookie jar? Not me. Crumbs all over and chocolate chip marks on my lips and all that, or whoever. I didn't do that. Anyway, not me. Why are we doing that? Because we don't want to get in trouble. So we lie about it. We don't want to have our image tarnished. Our image tarnished. Think about that for a minute. We are created in the image of God, and we are not to bear his image in vain, and yet we are lying to keep our own image from being tarnished. We should be worried about what we're doing to God's image, not what we're doing to our own image. We should literally allow our own image to be tarnished in order to give more glory to God. It's okay for us to say, I was wrong. I sinned. And I'm sorry. And I've confessed it to God Almighty. And he's forgiven me. He paid for it on the cross, and he's forgiven me. And I'll probably, do something in the future. Like, 10 minutes. We'll sin again, won't we? And it's okay for people to recognize we're sinners, because unless they recognize that we're sinners, they won't realize that sinners can be saved by grace. What is the reason that we lie? It's selfish. It's pride. It's elevating ourselves above our God. See, all of these things really come back to we are to have no other gods before him. We are to worship him and him alone. We are to, not even have anything that even competes with our loyalty to him. And the last one is, you shall not covet. You shall not covet. Sometimes I think we should use a different word, because covet isn't a word that we use day by day. If we were to use a modern word, want, desire, long for, you should not have this longing in your heart for something else. And he lists a bunch of things here. But at the end, he says anything that you don't have, you shouldn't have this longing desire in your heart for. Why? Because the longing desire in our heart should be for God and for God alone. He should be supreme. There should be nothing else before him, nothing else that even competes with him. All of these commands. And furthermore, if we look at covet, usually before we steal, we covet, don't we? Before we commit adultery, we covet, don't we? We might even covet before we commit murder. I don't know. I think that these, there's clearly an overlap here, but as you dig under the surface, why is it that people have longings for things that are not God himself? And of course, there could be a variety of reasons, but one of them is not trusting him. We just talked about stealing. One of them is not recognizing his total supremacy and his place in the universe, or outside of the universe, as it were, as creator of the universe. Really, coveting is literally idolatry when you get right down to it. It's God is not what I want. I want something else. That is idolatry. That's the core of idolatry. Literally placing some other person or thing above God in one's desire. Allowing something or someone to compete with our loyalty to God. Now I've mentioned there's so many ways that you can look at the Ten Commandments, and I'm probably doing a poor job here this morning because I'm combining different ones and I'm mentioning different ways of looking at this. Fundamentally, the Ten Commandments are about worshiping God and God alone, about recognizing his supremacy, about being fully loyal to him, about loving him to the point of obeying everything he says. Another way of looking at it is that obeying these commandments is literally fulfilling the purpose that he created us in his image. If we want to reflect his image, if we want to bear his image in the way that he intended, then we'll obey these commands. Obeying these commands literally results in our lives reflecting the true image of God. Another way to look at these last 6 is if we're honoring our father and our mother, guess what? We're probably not going to be committing murder or adultery or stealing or bearing false witness or coveting, unless our parents didn't teach us right, which is another problem. But if they've taught us, as the Lord has commanded them to do, then those things aren't going to be issues. Honoring our father and our mother is honoring God, and it's our life will go, we'll have a long life. Think about that promise that goes along with that command. Well, if you murder someone, you stand the possibility that you could be put to death, capital punishment, or you could be killed by someone else for, retribution. If you commit adultery, you could possibly lose your life. It's happened. It's one of the primary causes when they're investigating a murder. It's one of the motives that they look for. Stealing. You could lose your life stealing. You could get shot by a police officer, and it wouldn't be the police officer's fault. It would be your fault. You could get killed by a land, by the owner of whatever. It's legal to defend your own property to the point of killing someone if that's what's required. And bearing false witness and coveting, well, both of those things can eventually get you to a point, it takes, sin is like that. It keeps drawing you in, doesn't it? Lying about someone can lead to other things. If in order to keep that lie covered up, how many times have there been murders? If you watch TV and watch, murder mysteries, a lot of times you'll see that it goes back to something else. The reason for that murder. to keep a lie covered up and coveting. So yes, if we honor our father and our mother, just by natural consequence, we'll probably have a longer life, won't we? Well, we're going to go ahead and read now verses 22 through 33. And I don't know if I'll pause in the middle or wait till the end. I guess let's just see what happens. I don't want to go for too long. There's a lot that could be said, but I really am trying to get through the book of Deuteronomy in less than 10 years. So Moses did it, so surely we can do it, right? So after completing these 10 commands that were written down, Moses goes on, he says, "These words the Lord spoke to you all, to all your assembly at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice." And he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave it to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. And you said, "Behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness. And we have heard his voice, and out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of fire as we have and still lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord your God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord your God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it." Now I'll go ahead and stop there for a moment. And I find it interesting. I don't know as you read that if you connect with this, but this is sort of the people recognizing that God is a consuming fire and fearing him in a way that they should fear him. And yet, at the same time, there's something going on there that's a bit disingenuous. They already said, we can see that a man, Moses, has heard the voice of God and lived. So we know that can happen, but we are afraid that if we hear God's voice, if we continue hearing God's voice, that we'll be consumed. Well, why is that? On the one hand, it might mean that they're saying, well, we recognize we're sinners and we don't want to risk being consumed by his holy fire. On the other hand, they apparently, even recognizing that they're sinners, don't want to part with their sin. So we don't want to go too close to God because we've got this other thing that we're kind of keeping in our heart, and we don't want that exposed, and maybe we'll be killed, so we'll just stay over here. I'm not really convinced that they were sincere. I can definitely, understand, though. And we got those Levites, maybe they weren't Levites, standing where the Ark of the Covenant was about to go into the water, and it was, somebody tripped, and the Ark was going to fall, and so somebody reached out and grabbed it to keep it from falling, and God took them. So I can understand that they're afraid. That's probably a wise thing. I would dare say that if it were us, we would either be afraid or dead, one or the other. Because we don't take holiness as seriously as they took holiness. It's not right in front of our eyes where we see God's holiness result in someone losing their life. Ananias and Sapphira, remember them? who lied about, giving all of the money? It was very simple. They just didn't have to lie. They could have said, no, this isn't all of it. We sold the land, and so this much we're giving. All they had to do was tell the truth. But then, no, they lied. Now, God takes holiness very seriously, and we do not. Nor did they at that time. Well, let's go on in verse 28. And the Lord heard your words, Moses says, when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. They are right in all that they have spoken. Yes, there's a risk for them of being consumed by this fire because of unholiness. It's wise for them to be careful. It's really revealing that next verse 29. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and their descendants forever. If they don't obey his commands, their life won't be long, will it? That's a very real thing to them. And God says, oh, that their heart was always fearing me and keeping my commands. Well, I suspect that they were afraid because they weren't keeping his commands. We'll touch on this idea of fearing God in a few minutes, but just think through that a little bit. And then Moses goes on, he says, the Lord says, go and say to them, return to your tents. And then God says to Moses, but you stand here by me, and I will tell you the whole commandment, and the statutes and the rules, that you shall teach them, that they may do them in the land I am giving to them to possess. And Moses goes on, you shall be careful, therefore, to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the way the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you shall possess. See, they were focused on the fear because of lack of holiness, because of disobedience in their hearts. And Moses is reminding them, God reminded them, you should be focused on loving me and fearing me, but keeping my commands. Let fear be a motivation to obey me, God says. Well, I find one thing very interesting about this account of giving of the Ten Commandments. Do you notice anything missing here? Did anything happen that is not that Moses doesn't repeat to the people here? Now, this is another one of those things that I will leave with you this week to think about. Why didn't Moses remind the people about the golden calf? Why didn't he do that? Well, I don't know. If you'll I apologize. I was not intending to preach this long, but it is what it is. I want to go over to Exodus chapter 32. And I just want us to kind of relive this with Moses. And this idea of what was happening when God was giving Moses these 10 commands, and why it was that God said, yes, you're right, you should probably stay over in your tents instead of coming near the mountain. Verse 1 of chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up and make us gods who shall go before us. Up and make us gods who shall go before us. Now, I do have to give them a little bit of leeway. They hadn't yet walked through the wilderness with the cloud of, pillar of fire and pillar of cloud and all of that. Had not all happened yet at this point. But they had just seen God deliver them from Egypt. And one of the plague that caused the them to actually be delivered was the last one, where if they didn't have the blood of the lamb over the, on the doorpost or the over the lintel, that the oldest son would be killed. I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to pause here just for a moment. So why did God give Moses 10 plagues instead of one? Do we think God didn't know that all of those other plagues would not cause Pharaoh to release the children of Israel? Why did God give 10 plagues when God knew good and well that it was going to come down to that deliverance based on the blood of lambs that would later become a picture of the blood of the lamb? Why? Well, listened to a message a week ago, and it was suggested that the reason God did that was not because of the Egyptians, but to teach the Israelites. To teach the Israelites of his power. Anyway, I won't tarry there any longer, but up and make us gods who shall go before us. As for Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, notice they don't give God credit for them coming out of the land of Egypt. Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. So what did Aaron do? Now listen, God is going to be faithful to us. No, Aaron doesn't do that. He immediately says, okay, take off your rings of gold that are in your ears and of your wives, that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and daughters, and bring them to me. Just the way it's given here is without even a hesitation. Just bring them to me. So all the people took off their rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool. Fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. These are your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt. They didn't even exist until they took off the gold and melted it down and carved it into this, formed it into this golden calf. It didn't exist before that. And yet, here it's being presented. In place of who? In place of Yahweh. Can you see the violation of the Ten Commandments just unfold one after the other? When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. What's an altar for? An altar is for worship, for setting something apart. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, meanwhile, at the top of the mountain, meanwhile back at the ranch, go down, Moses, for your people. God's not claiming them anymore. This is like mom saying to dad, your son did blah, blah, blah. No. God says, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it. Sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. But Moses implored of the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, against your people? I'm not claiming them either, Moses says, with great power and with a mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? So now the Egyptians, instead of seeing God and glorifying him, they're going to see, well, he delivered his people from Israel just so that they could explode in the wilderness. Just all die right there, be consumed by that fire. Moses is making an appeal for God's grace. He says, turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, or Jacob, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised. I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Then Moses turned. Okay, this is just, God has a serious sense of humor. Just picture this now. Moses turned, went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of his testimony in his hand. Tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back, that were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people, now you say, where did Joshua come from? Well, if you go back a few chapters, you'll see that when Moses prepared to go up to the mountain, his assistant Joshua went with him. So Joshua was not down with the people, he was with Moses. So when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. But he said, it isn't the sound of the shouting for victory or the sound of cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as they came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. And he threw the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. After Moses pled to God to not consume them with his wrath, Moses sees what happened that God already knew, and he burned with anger at the people. He took the calf that they had made, and he burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. You're not going to live this one down. You're going to remember this. You're going to remember drinking this water contaminated by gold and whatever else was in the calf. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? Remember Aaron, the one who didn't hesitate? Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people. It's kind of sound like Eve in the garden, Adam in the garden. That wife you made for me. He says, you know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, who we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. It's just, you couldn't write this stuff, could you? Out came this calf. You remember when it said that Aaron formed the calf and he carved it? And when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Moses had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, notice he's saying, choose. Do you want to live or do you want to die? Who is on the Lord's side? Everybody had a choice at that time, but it was the Levites that came and gathered around him. And he said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from the gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day. The next day Moses went to the people. You have sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord. perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. You know, Moses, the one that had pled for God's mercy and then had come down and had lost his temper, and all this has transpired. Now he says, I might be able to persuade God. I might be able to make atonement for your sins. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold, but now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Moses offers himself in their stead. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. Remember, this is the generation that was going to die before going into the promised land. This is the generation that would not just die of old age, but they would be killed off, similar to the way 3,000 were killed on that day. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. I'm just going to go a little bit on further here. The Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you people, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you. I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. You go ahead, and I'll send my angel, and he'll deliver you, but I'm not going with you, because if I go with you, you're going to be consumed. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments, no one dressed up. It was a day of mourning. For the Lord had said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you. Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward, that is Sinai. I could go on. Later on, God does relent and say that he will go with them. Go ahead, continue reading this afternoon or this week. This is a very interesting story, but I come back to, why did Moses not remind these children of Israel of the golden calf? I don't know the exact answer, but I find it just extremely revealing that while God was giving the commands to Moses, that the children of Israel were breaking those commands already. It's like, you can't even let me write it down, and you're breaking the commands. Things that they already knew, things that he had already told them. In essence, they may not have been spelled out in commandments for them to read. Okay, well, let's sum up this morning then. God is supreme. The Lord our God is one. Our loyalty shall be to him and him alone. Number 2, we were created in his image, and obeying his commandments will fulfill that purpose. We will bear his image. We will indeed show forth his righteousness, his holiness. We will be those reflections on him that he created us to be to the world around us. I just want to read one verse in closing and remind us. Moses says, choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him. I find it very interesting in the book of Ecclesiastes, after Solomon spends all of this time looking for meaning in life, in all of these other things, as it were, all of the things that could be put before God. And he says there's vanity in all of those things. There's nothing that compares, essentially. He comes down to verse 13 in chapter 12, Ecclesiastes, and he says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. I think the King James says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This is what we were created for, to fear him and keep his commandments. And I've always, had these discussions with Dawn in the past about what, this idea of fear of God. Why does he say this to us? Does he want us to be afraid of him? No, he doesn't want us to be afraid of him. He wants us to respect him. If you disobey his commands, you better be afraid, as the Israelites were wisely afraid. But if you're obeying his commands because you love him, then you actually are respecting him. So the word fear can mean both things. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Let's close in a word of prayer together.